Hey all, welcome back to the lab. In this video, I'm announcing CinderBlockHtml, which is a C# DSL for building HTML with composable building blocks. So I've been exploring modern C# and how I might build web apps with it using simple scalable systems. That's often what we do here on the channel. So I'm exploring C# for that. Now I like building with the HAM stack, which is hypermedia on a monolith, which usually means doing a lot of server-side rendered HTML in whatever language or tech stack I'm using. Now in F#, I've been using Falco.markup and Cloudseed, which is my F# project boilerplate for this HTML generation, but I've noticed that C# doesn't have a DSL option that at least I feel is as ergonomic. And so I decided to build CinderBlockHtml to port the experience of Falco.markup from F# to C# so I could have kind of a similar tool at my disposal in this other language. Okay, so what is CinderBlockHtml? I have it on GitHub here. And basically, CinderBlockHtml is an HTML DSL aiming to make it simple to construct server-side HTML with flexibility, performance, and robustness. And basically, all of these come because it is really just C# code. And because it's just C# code and not just like raw strings that you're passing around, you get a lot of benefits. Well, I guess I should say the most important thing is that you actually get type-safe inputs and outputs. We now have type safety on the HTML that we're passing around, which helps ensure that like some random string somewhere isn't missing, an end brace, which is going to cause your HTML to look all funky. Although I will say HTML is pretty good at handling for these cases, but still, raw strings, pretty dangerous to pass around because it's really easy to make one mistake that kind of blows up the page. And so it's all type safe. We've got this all built in code. And so this allows us to say like, hey, the result of these functions is not just a string. This is actually HTML. And we can know this is HTML, and so we can then do operations on HTML all in a type-safe manner. Because this is just code and really objects, we can use things like loops and link and if statements all natively, because really it's just nested lists, I should say, of HTML nodes. And because we get this idea of this is all just code, we can start building server-side components that feel more like what people miss from React. I think a lot of people like the idea of React because it feels type safe and you can pass in props and you can get, nodes and JSX back and stuff. Obviously, doing things server-side like this is not going to be as dynamic as those, but we can get pretty close, at least in what our HTML generation looks like, and it's going to start looking a lot more like React functional components, without all the hooks and nonsense like that. And so that's the general gist of it, but I also wanted to show you an example, and let's go here to actually show you this so we get some syntax highlighting. And so here's probably the simplest example from the README, where you can basically just say using, and then we're just going to create a simple div, and you can just do lm.div. We're going to pass in the attributes that it has. Here it just has a class of container, and then it has text of hello world. And, it's a little bit more verbose than, the actual HTML itself, but it really kind of resembles the structure that you'd be using if you were using HTML nested or pretty printed. And that's the basic example. And I think a better example is to show what we would actually be building. So here's one of our benchmarks where we're basically building a list of items. And so we're using link to go over all of the items and turn these into list items. Pretty readable, easy to see how this is HTML. And then below we're actually building the full HTML page with an HTML outer wrapper. We've got a head here, we've got a body, and then we're passing in the unordered list, or the items to the unordered list here. And that's how we're building up this HTML page. And so really kind of resembles, HTML again, and the kind of indentation that we'd be using, even what the layout would be with the element here and all of the attributes here, and then all the children next or inside of it. But this is all C# code, so it's all type safe, and we can use all of our special functions and stuff on it, like link. All right, so why use CinderBlockHtml? And I get it, DSLs or domain-specific languages are bespoke, and they can get very confusing. I probably have a 50-50 hit rate for oh, this is a DSL. Is this actually going to help me or hurt me? Because I have to learn everything new about whatever this thing is. And, there's also many other ways to produce server-side HTML in .NET with tools like Razor and Razorlight and Scribon, 80, DV8, HTML tags, just to name a few that I looked up this past week. And what I would say is that the main sticking point, or the main reason I think CinderBlockHtml wins here, is that it's simple, it's readable, and it's composable. And I think probably templating is the most popular way to do HTML in C# and .NET. And the paradigm for that is basically to build up a template string then you compile the template, and then you're going to parse HTML output using input. So you're going to pass inputs into the template, and then it's going to do some matching stuff, fill those things in, and then you're going to get the string back. That's basically how this works. And a lot of people like that in C#, and that's fine, but I personally find this to be pretty cumbersome, inefficient, and often not as type safe as I'd like. Not all of these templating systems will actually tell you the types of the inputs, or throw if, or I guess raise an error if the types are not aligned, which means you don't find this out till runtime. And like, if you have good tests, then you'll catch all this stuff. But if you don't have good tests, then you're going to catch this in prod, which is something we probably want to avoid. And I also think that composing multiple templates together is quite hard. And, when you're just using static, multi-page applications where you just hit a web page and you get the full thing back, this isn't so much of a deal because you won't have so many partials. But I think when we're going towards a more hypermedia focused approach where you might be doing HTMX or Alpine Ajax or Datastar, where we're actually building HTML in a way such that parts of it can be dynamically moved and returned, then you are going to be using a lot of partials. And I think the ability to compose partials together in sort of like server-side components, if you will, is really important. And so these tools, in my opinion, make a lot of that stuff pretty cumbersome to do. And another reason I kind of stay away from them. And just to give you like an example of this, so here we are in one of my other benchmarks. And so, I've got Screebon here, which is literally just a string-based template. And you can see that these are like the variables, but like this isn't type safe, right? Like if I miss one of these bracket things, then this thing's just going to come out as like hello world, which is like weird and broken, but I wouldn't find this unless I tested it. Same with Razorlight. We have a Razor template here, and I believe this would throw because that model wouldn't have anything. But either way, it's basically just raw strings that you won't find till runtime if it's broken. And then, the way that you use this is then you kind of say, oh, get my template and render here, which is just like fine, but it's, another layer of indirection because you're like, well, what is that thing? Can I click in and look at it? And so, some people really like this. I think C# really leans into this. It's fine, but I just personally don't like this approach. And so HTML DSLs really allow you to build HTML with the same ergonomics that you like your programming language for. I'm assuming that you chose your programming language, that you like your programming language. That might not be true. Some people are forced into it where you work, or you're just using what you know. But in general, you chose this programming language for a reason, so you probably like the ergonomics, and HTML DSLs allow you to keep using that for building up this HTML, which I think is really good. And so in my opinion, I think, CinderBlockHtml is the easiest to read and still competitively performant among the other ones out there. But of course, subjective, so we're going to have to, check them out and see for yourself. Now, for examples of the different syntaxes of each, you can check out these examples, and I'm actually just going to show you a few of them in here because I've got them all, and probably this hello world. So I already showed you the templating ones here, which is pretty common in HTML or in C#, but I just don't personally like them. We've also got 80 HTML, which looks okay when you use this syntax, but I will note that it has these weird underscores which are meaningful, which I don't like. Like this one doesn't have an underscore. Why is that? It's because it doesn't have children. The children come over here. I think this is a bit inconsistent, and I really don't like the syntax when it's like doesn't have HTML leading this. To me, this is just a bit too minimal, but I understand people might like the minimal more than the kind of explicit verbose version of CinderBlock, especially people who are maybe from ML languages. This might look a lot better, but personally, I don't like this approach just because it's harder for me to scan for whatever reason. Another one is HTML tag, which I think is the most popular one of all of these. And in my opinion, the news everywhere and the appends everywhere are kind of causing a lot of just noise that's unnecessary. Although I will say I do like how you can kind of do the indentation to match the indentation of the HTML, which I do think aids in readability. And so that's just a taste of these. Again, I have several different benchmarks here, each with different syntaxes or showing all the different frameworks doing them. So if you want to compare them, I think that's a good place to go. Finally, on performance, so how does CinderBlockHtml perform? I think performance is rarely the top factor in choosing a code library, but it is something to keep in mind as it may be a deal breaker if it's too slow. And I think CinderBlockHtml is very competitive with other HTML DSLs and templating libraries, really only falling behind raw strings and 80s performance-focused design. Now, as always, all benchmarks do have asterisks, so you will need to run your own benchmarks on your own workloads to understand how they'll actually perform in prod. So all I can do is kind of give you some directional numbers, but actual HTML is going to be different. Your actual workloads are going to be different, so don't take these as like truth. And so currently my benchmarks are running 6 different libraries, I guess, or paradigms for HTML generation across 3 different scenarios. But I will say that this is probably the bare minimum we could have. If you want to add a scenario or a generation method, just make a PR and we can add it. And so the first is the Hello World benchmark, which is rendering the simple Hello World HTML page. I showed you this, or a few examples of this in some of the frameworks. And it uses constraints to simulate a small amount of dynamism. And so basically we're building up this HTML page, right? HTML, it's got head, it's got a body, and then we're just passing in some variables to kind of see how it performs there. And when we do this, we see that the fastest is, raw string HTML. It takes like 0 time because it's literally just like a single string interpolation. Super easy. Second is 80 HTML, and then CinderBlock. And then we've got HTML tags, Razorlight, and Scribon coming in quite slow for this. And so CinderBlock is pretty competitive, although I will say that these are all nanoseconds, so it's all pretty fast. Your app's not going to crash on any of these, but still, CinderBlock pretty competitive. The next is the list benchmark. So I've got this here, and this is the one we're talking about where we're going to list all the items. There's 100 of these, and then we're going to build a simple HTML page, and then we're just going to plop the elements in here in an unordered list. And this is basically just saying like, how good are you at doing long pages, which is relatively common on HTML pages. And so here we can see that in first is raw string, and then 80 and CinderBlock are basically neck and neck, and then Razorlight and HTML tags are next, and then finally Scribon coming in last. And finally, we've got our nested benchmark. This one is a bit harder to show because it's going to be different across each of these. Like in templating, you can't really do this super well. And this is kind of going back to what I was talking about of like templating is a bit hard for nested partials or dynamic partials, but it's pretty natural for something like CinderBlock. And so basically what we're doing is building up this recursive chain of divs, where in each div it's going to be like div, product, and then the next div inside of it, and that'll just recurse down. And what we're trying to show here is like what an actual complex HTML page would be like, where you are building up several components, and each of the components might be, in levels deep because it, renders itself in a sufficiently large or complex app. This is actually what HTML is going to look like. And then once we have that, we just, surround it in an HTML page, and we start off the chain here. And so for these, we can see that everything gets a lot slower. 80 HTML is still, just as fast, and then CinderBlock is second, with raw string, Razorlight, Scribon, and HTML tags all within a few microseconds. And so all this to say that, CinderBlock is not the fastest, but it is very competitive amongst the other ones. And so if you like this syntax more than the other ones, then it's probably a pretty good choice, and performance isn't going to be a blocker. Next. So I'll be continuing to hack on this as I build with it in more of my side projects. Please let me know if you have any feedback or suggestions. It's the first time I'm sharing it out, the first time people are going to be using it. And so I'm sure there's like pretty easy low-hanging fruit that we could improve. Also wanted to give a quick shout out to Pim, who's a creator of Falco and Falco.markup, for building the original library. I really enjoy the original syntax of the library, and this port is largely a one-to-one mapping of that syntax and the structure of the library, so this wouldn't have happened, without Falco.markup, so shout out for that. Now, if you like this post, you might also like the Ham Stack, a simple scalable tech stack for building modern web apps fast and cheap. Might also be interested in why F# is a fun programming language. And finally, build a full stack web app with F# and Falco, including some examples of Falco.markup if you want to see how you might build with it and also compare it to the syntax of CinderBlock HTML. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.